Okay, guys, thank you very much for joining our webinar today on GDPR. As Eddie's pointed out here, a la Game of Thrones, GDPR is coming, whether we're ready for it or not. And there are a lot of organisations who should be worried about it who aren't, and particularly organisations who are thinking of doing new projects in 2018. So we're just going to give a few minutes for everybody to join the call. Just while we're doing that, just to introduce myself, I'm John Eaton, Head of Digital Strategy and Sales at i3. I'm in Leeds at the moment. Alongside me there's Robin, he's also in Leeds.
Hi there.
And we've got Eddie, who is over with the team in Belfast.
Hi everyone.
Cool. So just while we've got people coming along, just to sort of, I think I've probably done enough introducing of myself. I've even got bored of my own voice. So Robin, do you want to give us a bit of background into what you do and how you help customers with GDPR?
Yeah, so with Data Hive, I set this up to work with digital agencies of size 10+ staff, and I use data research and then engagement of that audience data to help build sort of new business introductions and conversations and ways to go out to market. Before Data Hive, I was working within publishing industry, and before that was sort of business-to-business energy, and then also pharmaceuticals. In each of those, we've used a lot of data. We've collected data from marketing and passed through to sales. So there's probably not many things that could go wrong that I haven't experienced. So hopefully we can share some aspects of some of the challenges and just give you an insight into what I've done in the past or how we've approached stuff. And then, yeah, just see if we've got some value into your listeners today.
Cool. And Eddie, from your side, a bit of background on yourself.
Of course, yeah. It's Eddie Ryce here. I'm one of the customer success managers in i3 Digital. And it's really my role to make sure that our customers are getting the best out of the solutions and the products that they have. And we'll be able to share those success stories with people like yourselves.
Okay, good stuff. So without further ado, we'll interject as necessary, just to add a bit more value to everybody on the course. Thanks a lot for joining us. And I think, Eddie, you're going to start off with a bit of a presentation about what all this stuff means.
I am, yes. So good afternoon, everyone. And again, John, thanks for the introduction as well. This is just a kind of synopsis of what we're going to be going over today. Again, it's not going to be death by PowerPoint, so I aim to keep you guys awake. But first of all, what we're really going to be talking about is what the rules mean and what they mean to you as organisations, and also what you need to do before the 25th of May 2018. I'd also like to highlight, though, our next webinar is on Monday the 4th of December at 3 o'clock, and it's how to write a brief for a successful digital transformation project. So if you'd like to sign up for that, please reach out to Keith at i3digital.com, and he'll happily do that for you and sign you up to that one as well. So, what are the rules and why they apply to you? I mean, first of all, what I'd like to do is give a quick run through of the aspects of both people, or as in the eyes of the EU, also known as data subjects, and what the rules mean to them and how they apply to you guys, the companies, as well. I mean, to really talk about, for customers and everyone else, it's really about the right to data correction. And what that means is really, it's given them, your subject matters, a chance to change any previously provided information and make adjustments as necessary. Tighter consent and requisitions, and what that really means is given data subjects or people that they must be informed and consulted on anything related to processing their personal data or ways in which that data might be used. The right to be forgotten is quite an important one. It's given subjects or people the chance to erase all the data stored on them with the information, but then being able to prove that that's been done as well. Notification on data endangerment and current state. It's quite a long one, but really during the whole data handling process, people have to be informed on what is happening to their personal data and also if it's at risk. I mean, quite funnily, what's happened to me recently is I got a letter in the post by Equifax saying that they had a data breach 5 months ago. and I only got the letter yesterday. So you know that's a pretty good kind of scenario of how that will come into place. Privacy by default. It's quite an important one. Obviously, you know, once the agreement has been made between your data subjects and yourselves, that any divergence from the terms of this is only possible once an additional agreement has been made by all parties. So if someone has signed up to receive newsletters on a particular subject, you need to ask their permission to send them any information that is out with that. And something we get asked day in and day out, you know, especially from people who are in the United States or out with the EU, does GDPR apply to companies outside of the EU? And really, in short, the answer to that is if your company does any form of trade with any customers within the EU, then the GDPR rules apply to you if you store, process, or share EU citizens' personal data. So the short answer is yes, it does apply to you people.
Just as a question, Eddie, for organisations that use Salesforce.com, which is obviously based in America and subject to the Safe Harbour Act, should they be particularly concerned about the fact that they're working, you know, potentially with software firms that are outside of the EU as well?
Yeah, they should definitely be aware of that kind of matter and actually have a process in place which could mitigate against that as well, John.
Cool.
So coming on just to the responsibilities of data controllers and data processors. I mean, what deciphers who's a processor and who's a controller? I mean, the controller is, as it actually describes here, it means the natural legal person or public authority really who determines the purposes and means of processing of personal data. And then the processors is anyone who is acting as an agency or third party for that as well. So the organization that determines the means of processing personal data controllers, for example, if we have a bank who's using that information. However, if they digitize that information and pass it on to a third party, for example, a data center or a document management company, both these organizations are responsible for handling the personal data of the customers. And there's quite strict rules around that as well. We've got accountability for violation of breaches. And both controllers and processors can be held responsible by the supervisory authority in the event of any negligence of personal data security or even not complying with the GDPR requirements. And there's harsh sanctions for this as well, for actually not complying with this. I mean, if the GDPR stipulates that by not complying with any or part of the regulation can lead to penalties of up to 4% of total global annual turnover or 20 million, whichever is the higher amount. So the implications are quite serious. Embedded security matters. So really, the security of personal data should not be an afterthought when it comes to setting in the infrastructure of the development of that as well. Visibility of the data flow. I mean, for years and years, especially within the food processing, traceability and accountability is key. And that's really what the visibility of the data flow is coming down to. It's the information, the actions executed must always remain traceable and visible to both parties. And full functionality in data handling. So what that really is implying is that all implemented habits and technologies must serve the sole purpose they were intended for. So not out with any of that as well. And last but not least, my favourite, end-to-end security. Nothing says security more than a pit bull, but really not allowing any gaps during the data handling process and constantly managing security and information and the actions taken by anyone or the data users allowed the control of that data flow. I mean, John, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're finding, both Robin and I think, in talking to organisations is that point there around end-to-end security is where a lot of companies are falling down. There's a lot of thought put into how people's details are acquired, and put into a set of conversion tools to try and get them to buy any number of services. But actually, that's never really been thought about by a lot of organizations from the point of view of security. So you end up with lots of data existing in databases where no one really knows where it came from and what the overall usage rights are for using that data, which is why you've got companies like Wetherspoons throwing all their data away. And I think a large part of the reason for that, which hasn't really been reported yet, is that the enforcement of the rules was previously going to be pushed by a governmental department via the ICO. It's actually been announced recently that it's being considered that actually the company who will be enforcing the fines will be not a not-for-profit, i.e. public, as in privately motivated to try and make profit. So people are very nervous now, understandably, that they could end up in a situation where they are paying that big fine. Anything to add, Robin?
Yeah, I think end-to-end security, a lot of businesses think about the data coming into their business and then how it exits the business. A lot of the security issues often fall with the internal teams using that data and sharing that, how they pass that data within the business. Obviously, secure servers are the key, but some companies will restrict access to USB stick usage, anything where people can put attachments into emails. You need to think about, if you've got different team staff across your data, who's actually, who's keeping the list of who had access when, where, and how. Some of that can be quite laborious, so it's just having a sort of preference or guidance for your team. If you work with contractors or subcontractors, what are you sharing or giving access to on especially things like Drive, Google Drive, and the secure sites? It's very easy to sort of leave something out there that's just been stored for online and then forget that you've had access or revoke that access at times. So it's just making sure you've got a process for internal as part of that end-to-end.
Very good. So really what you need to implement before the 20th of May 2018, I mean, we kind of summarised it here. But really, I mean, obviously the impact on everyone's business is undoubtedly going to be huge. I mean, the new rules will require businesses large and small across the globe really to transform their policies, their structure and personnel, really to ensure compliance and adherence. And so that's going to be quite a big task for people. I mean, data protection and security has to be built really into a fabric of organisations rather than farmed out or siloed. So really, while your security and compliance people should be very concerned with getting the detail right, every other colleague, so everyone else in the organisation should really care about this as well and be aware of the principles and also the sanctions against it as well at every level within the organisation and every discipline. But really, I mean, if businesses and organisations see this as an opportunity to represent themselves to their customers and target audiences really more of a responsible and empathetic way, then surely it can't be a bad thing, right? I mean, this will partially be true, kind of enable stronger relationships and building those relationships because it potentially offers a basis for more equality and trust between businesses and their customers. Is that something you would agree with, Robin?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a lot been said both by the ICO and other commentators about the sort of overall idea of being a good neighbour when it comes to data. So although the rules aren't in some cases explicit as to what you're supposed to do, and some of the definitions are very loose as well, so although this is supposed to apply to consumers, there are certain elements of B2B, such as when you're dealing with sole traders, where the European Union's own rules about what defines a customer and what defines a company are very, very loose. So I think, one of the pieces of advice that we've heard and we've been suggesting to our clients is that to try and be a good neighbour when it comes to data, make sure that you're treating that data as if it's your own and protecting it as if it's your own as well.
I think from my side, Eddie, as well, it's worth companies will think that they are either a processor or a controller, but in many cases they will blend the two depending on how they use different parts of data they collect and manage in the business. They may have some data for sales that they process differently, but actually they're collecting things in marketing. So it's worth understanding the size of the business and then who's doing what within those different functions. because you could fall into the trap of being seen as both, depending on how that data moves through your company.
Very good. I mean, guys, what I've done here is I've included, if you download the PowerPoint presentation after this, I've included links to a pretty good infographic which kind of details it and it kind of shows it in layman terms. And there's also some free learning from a company called Learning Pool around GDPR, which you get a 7-day free sign up and you can do quite a few courses, one of which is around GDPR. So it'll just allow you to educate not only yourselves but your colleagues as well around the changes and why they're important too. But really, digital transformations, you know, and why GDPR was kind of always in the forefront and the mind of this. I mean, a mantra that we live by here at IT Digital around transformation projects has been Ryce, responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. I mean, what makes digital transformation projects different to bog standard website projects is the sheer number of internal and external stakeholders who are involved in the whole project process. I mean, the reality is that most of the time, departments outside of IT and marketing, for example, customer service and finance, and even senior management teams, they're really kept at arm's length or consulted and informed after it. But really moving forward, in review of the customer strategy and technology infrastructure, we really have to consider how customers can be forgotten and really how much information we gather on them in the first place and how that is used and siloed and how that information can be accessed. I mean, we still think that Ryce is applicable, but that the project discovery is likely to lead to change requests and internal data handling processes. And that's likely to see less people kept at arm's length and more of them being responsible and accountable at the project planning stage as well. Have you got any thoughts around that, John? Is that pretty much on the money?
I think you're absolutely right. The key thing is responsibility. But Ryce, loosely applied, used to often in digital transformation projects lead to nobody being really accountable for anything. There'd be areas of responsibility, but ultimately that was more subject areas where people were experts and therefore had to be consulted before they got any sort of decisions made on that particular area of an overall project. But I think, with the responsibilities that now come with being controllers and processors of data, I think that's not wishy-washy anymore. You have to make sure that the people who are involved in those roles understand their responsibilities.
Okay. So really about web personalization and market automation and retargeting and how it's come into play there as well. I mean, for most organizations adopting a personalization strategy, this is typically the kind of current trend, where you get as many data collection points as possible to generate that whole holistic 360 view, 360-degree view of their customers, with using different tools like HubSpot, Salesforce, and lead forensics, and then blending that all into one single point of user data. I mean, it's something that we're likely here to kind of talk about. I mean, for us here in IT, it's unlikely that we'll see this practice change, as it's largely driven by customers' interaction. But for us, it's more about that single point of user data, which will become more and more important, in turn making it easier to comply with the rights of your data subjects or your customers, and be able to gather that information in quite a succinct way. I mean, for those that don't really know what a single point of user data is, there's a very good webinar, which again I've linked off to within this PowerPoint presentation. When you download it later on, I'll take you right to that presentation and bring you right up to speed on it. Well, what we see is that people are using both the CMS and their CRM to help aid the embedding of what could be known as a SPUD, or a single point of user data. This really drills down into the advantages of having a single point of user data and how they apply in the real world. But in the relation to the GDPR, failing to have a central repository and strategy for gathering customer data will really mean a lot of administration going forward. If someone asks for the right to be forgotten, where are all those records held? How are you getting them up? How are you getting the access to them? Do you hold it all within your CRM? Do you have it on your content management system, or do you have it in one single point of user data? One area that might be particularly interesting though is IP tracking technology, which is often kept away from the customer CRM records. And sending personalised retargeted messages based on previous activity really could lead to GDPR infringement. So that's something that will have to be considered as part of the digital transformation projects and how you're using all these different marketing tools with the likes of Magento and HubSpot. I mean, also, what happens if a friend of somebody who's asked to be forgotten recommends a piece of content or a product to them? Do we need to really have to go through a validation process that shows the customers on our blacklist? You know, it's going to be a huge administration task, but if you've got all that information in one point, it can actually lend itself to be a much easier transition.
I think just as a sort of add-on to that, Eddie, we're actually in the same building here as the Yorkshire Post, who are part of the Johnson's Press group. And we were talking before we came in, actually, that they're going to have a real challenge when it comes to that sort of single point of user data, because there is so many different points of data collection within what these guys do. And increasingly, because we've both got backgrounds in journalism and we know this, the relationship between the press and advertisers has completely changed. So nowadays, you often are advertising through display networks, and if that has any sort of reciprocal data collection as part of the commercial agreement, that needs to be very carefully considered as to what people start doing post 25th of May, because you could end up in a real mess.
Yeah, so one of the challenges at Johnson Press when I was there was, and any publishers really, or people using a lot of audience side, is the use of programmatic networks, because advertisers, so we didn't have a big view of places like Lotame's data set, but Lotame offers its advertising solution out to everybody else, so it holds its data from you, so it's difficult to create a single customer viewpoint, which is the term we used. There's lots of different acronyms for it, but it's just understanding who's doing what where, and that's one of the challenges. Is if you're plugging or monetizing through data or an audience, you need to consider who's collecting data that you aren't able to access, but it's happening on your site, because it may be that you're culpable in some respects unless you give that as part of your terms and conditions or your privacy policy. It's about transparency of what's happening, really, I think.
I suppose that transparency is key, Robin, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. I mean, here at IT Digital, we're kind of vendor agnostic, but, you know, one thing that we feel is that one of the content management providers, Kentico, is actually leading the way in the CMS arena in terms of GDPR compliance, as they've actually built in some functionality that really allows users' consent to be created, updated, stored, and then displayed on your website or wherever whenever you need it, which then leads back into this accountability and traceability, and being able to report if you have been able to forget about somebody when that requirement has been put in as well. And that's going to help massively, really, when it comes to that reporting on that as well. And just for your benefit, when you download this PowerPoint, I've actually included a YouTube clip of how that's put into practice to let you show that as well, and you know, you can view it at a time that's convenient to yourselves as well. I mean, John was actually at the event where they were going through that. John, I thought you could maybe delve into a little bit more around that as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area, because obviously contact management isn't something that's new to CMS in the same way that it's not new to CRM. But I think what Kentico are trying to facilitate here is speed. So I'm not sure if anyone's seen in the press recently the person who requested all their data from Tinder and got a 900-page document back covering all of the different stuff that they've been doing over the course of that dating experience online. And I think because one of the things you have to do as part of the GDPR regulations is if somebody asks to have their data, you have to send it back to them so they can transport it somewhere else. Kentico have got a neat solution for that, which is that if you're logged in, you can revoke your consent or you can request access to your data, and that can be captured somewhere in the CMS. It's better to capture it online than have somebody send that in via an email response, because if it goes into a general email folder or even worse comes in over the phone, how do you communicate that a particular customer wants to be forgotten or wants to have their consents amended or wants to have access to their data without causing a lot of work for the organization? So I think it's quite useful to see that CMS providers are taking this seriously and providing potentially a way of streamlining that process.
So that kind of summarises the webinar. I mean, has anyone got any questions? We'd like to receive anyone's question in there.
So there's a questions tab to the right-hand side and a chat as well. We've also had a few questions in just as we've been going on through email as well. So the first one is from Steve in Bristol. Steve wants to know, Eddie, from the point of view of initial requests for people who want to have their data forgotten, what sort of timelines do you have to work to in terms of getting those people forgotten? What sort of process is involved?
It's quite a tight time frame. You have 7 working days to prove that that is the case and for you to be able to report on that as well. Essentially, they would then request that information. You would then have to run through your process internally and actually run that report and then go back to them with the results of that.
Okay, cool. And if someone has been forgotten, how do you prove you've forgotten them without, you know, sort of having a record of them? It's a bit odd, that, isn't it, as a concept? How do you prove you've forgotten someone you're supposed to have forgotten about?
So one way, if I can interject this, one way that people do have to remember as consumers, and you may have to give them this as data, is you can request access and to be forgotten of a system. But if you've signed up and you're doing a paid service, although you take somebody off your marketing database, you still have a legal right to keep them on your service database, because if there's any changes to that platform, until they revoke their payments or their contract, you'll still potentially have to keep them updated about anything that changes with that service if that was in contract when they signed up in your terms and conditions. One way of doing that, and I've had this before, where we were managing a lot of people trying to leave different websites or different sign-ups. Somebody actually found the CEO's email address, directly emailed the CEO, who then forwarded it back throughout the company saying, just get this person off. And we were saying, it's been done, but how do we let them know? Because it didn't come through a process where we could manage them. But just a simple service message that maybe goes out to say, you know, it's not from somebody in the marketing team, it's from the actual service one that says, after this email, you shouldn't receive any more. This is just a cursory note to say that your process has been requested. And I think it comes back to that process. But you also need to give people an understanding of time frames to come off data. When you're dealing with large data sets and APIs that bust that data backwards and forwards, it can be up to 24, 48 hours for different systems to synchronize. So if you're sending multiple campaign emails out, say through different sites or different campaigns, and somebody has got themselves signed up to lots of these, they may still get a pattern of email sends until they are removed. So we tended to say, look, 7 to 14 days standard because of our campaigns and our automation plans. If you're still having a problem, here's a service support number to call so that they don't have to email back in, so they don't become part of that. But it's just giving somebody the right tools to get them off, and then managing those expectations. Everybody's aware of real-time data, and I think a lot of consumers and a lot of businesses think that can happen for getting people off, but it's a lot slower than that. And I think, you know, it's managing those expectations and directing them out.
I think another thing, just to add on to that, is anybody here who's monitored by the Financial Services Authority obviously has their own rules and regulations in respect of keeping hold of policy documentation and that sort of thing. So there are, as I said earlier on, grey areas to how the rules are going to be implemented, because there are some organisations that, because of their own regulatory requirements, will have to keep information on customers in order to be able to comply. So I think that's another area that's going to be, you know, slightly confusing. We've got another question in here. Let me just have a look at this. Okie dokie. Next one here. how can you account for age of consent being 13? If a customer signs up, how can we prove their age? Theoretically, the customer can lie.
Okay, so we're having this issue with our children at the moment who are looking at trying to get into social media. And I think if you're working with social media or content that maybe, say you're selling at maybe more adult-based products, or you've got a service that is maybe open for more adult content, like, you know, it could be anything to do with sports or high-impact wrestling, things like that. You know, you've got different things there. I think you're going to have to double check. I mean, you can use data and credit checks, but you have to use that at a certain age, so 18 and above. There is probably cost for getting hold of that data, but you probably need to talk to people about the right ways to get that. Anything with a child data, I'd get legal advice on that, because I think you can look at the account names, but it depends on how people are accessing through devices. You can always get on your parent's device and still access stuff. So it's to do with parental settings, or maybe updates in the app, confirmations, double opt-ins. You'd need to, I think, because of the scope around children and issues with underage content access, you'd need to just get some legal advice.
Yeah, I did a project a couple of years ago for Toys R Us where we wanted to have engagement with users who were even under the age of 13. And some of the trickiness around that project was, like you say, how we manage engagement but don't encourage engagement to a point where we're starting to collect data. So one of the things that we did on that project was we allowed users to set up their own access to information, but we didn't use what you'd see as a standard adult registration process, so that there wasn't the gathering of real data. So we created avatars effectively, so people could be users just in the same way as even 20 years ago people could sign up for things like Team Chat, but without actually giving away their real information.
Yeah, and I think also I wouldn't have any systems that hold either IP or geographical data, so that there's nothing you're collecting through your cookies that could aggregate that if somebody accessed your systems, they could then create a personal point of data. I think you've got to work out what your key data would need to be. If it's to do with engagement, then maybe it's time on page, not necessarily the user details of the IP. You know, you'd build your system to do that. A good one to look at is how the BBC works. So the CBBCs, look at their terms and conditions, look at how they're using. I go and study and benchmark for the industry, and there's a lot around social media apps where there's an assumed point of responsibility. I would always say, you know, don't assume. Work from the assumed aspect that they are lying, and try and make them, you know, try and hold data in a way that, you know, if it was breached, or if somebody, you were to look at it, you couldn't tell anything other than what you're measuring. So again, it all depends on your reason for collecting data, and that goes back to what you were saying, Eddie. You've got to define what it is you need to collect, why you need to collect it, and then how you're going to securely and safely store that or manage that.
And then there's another question here, which probably is directly towards you, Eddie. So Kate missed the slide on single point user data, and she's saying, is this mandatory or a recommendation? And she's added on to that, how is it possible to only have one single point user data if you use Salesforce but also have an internal SQL database?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. First of all, it's not mandatory. It's just a recommendation. And really the basis of that is about how you're collecting that information and being able to report on it from just one aspect. And I guess it goes down to how you use that information and where it's being stored. And as part of the digital transformation project, you know, you can scope out where that information is going to be collated and stored. For example, you may want to use all the information that's coming in from your content management system, but base it all in your Salesforce, whether you use the Salesforce CRM to kind of store all that information as well.
I think one thing to add to that is just, sorry, Eddie, just I'm thinking, I think from the point of view of when you see Salesforce and internal SQL databases being used within one organization, often the reason for collecting the data is different from one system to the other. which actually makes the GDPR regulations a bit easier to apply. So, an example where I've seen internal SQL databases used, it's either from the point of view of HR, or alternatively, it's for the point of view of managing, say, a group of partner organizations. So, again, there are still some rules there that apply within GDPR. So why are you holding that information? Is it possible for people to unsubscribe from them? Whereas with Salesforce, often it's about customer acquisition and lead generation and that sort of thing.
Something else to just maybe consider, Kate, is if you can attribute in Salesforce to first sign-up points. So if you're using an SQL or a large database that has large relational data or data that maybe somebody's signed up on 3 or 4 different campaigns as a marketing experience-wise, if they've entered different competitions, you may want to assign in Salesforce an attributing one of those, which one of those was the most important, or is it a first point of contact or a last point of contact? And that may help sort of manage the difference between data in one base to another. So you assign maybe on a first point basis, or you assign on a most recent. So when you're transferring data or moving stuff across, again, it's this way you become a processor to an actual controller, yeah. And it's understanding those points of change and why you need them to happen. Single point of customer is great from a marketer's point of view because you really want to understand as much about the people that get to the end point of buying as possible, so you can try and find ways to find more of them or understand the thinking and change your marketing to speak to more of those people. It's a kind of hidden ideal for a lot of people, or a golden chalice. But you can always look at tracks of data, not necessarily personal single point of view. But again, it gets more complex the more things you have, the more channels you have as a marketer. But yeah, it's recommended to help build avatars, things like that. So,
well, one of the things I add on to this, actually, just a thought about it. Kate, if the reason for having the internal SQL database is so you can interrogate sales data, that's a whole interesting area there, because what organizations are not going to want to do is forget people and their orders, because the orders is really important from the point of view of financial planning and demand planning for the next year. So again, that probably comes back to thinking about how you write your terms and conditions. So it might be that you'd say, you can give us consent about how we use your personal data, but we do reserve the right to hold on to transaction data anonymously after the fact. Okay, I think that's all the questions we've got. Eddie, is there anything more that's come through on your email while we've been chatting away there?
Nothing's came through, guys. We will keep a record of the questions that we answered and serve out to everybody in the answers around that as well. The next steps really, and other things that are going to cover here, is the next webinar, as I said, is on Monday the 4th of December at 3 p.m. The topic again is how to write a brief for a successful digital transformation project. So if you are interested in taking part, please email Keith on the details there, and he'd love to register your interest for that as well. So all that's left, guys, to say thank you very much for your time today. And John and Robin, thank you very much for taking part in this as well.
Thank you very much.
It's been great. Thank you for having us.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.